79. A frail man sat in a quiet television studio, the air humming with the soft feedback of a forgotten microphone. The cameras were not yet rolling, but his confession had already begun, not to the world, but to the woman who would never hear it again. "She was the gentlest person I ever knew," he whispered, "and I ruined her peace by loving her." He was speaking of Audrey Hepburn. For decades, Hollywood had told a simpler story: the graceful beauty, the perfect icon, the woman who belonged to no scandal. Yet beneath that polished mythology, there existed another Audrey, one who knew what it meant to love in silence, to protect someone's name even when it cost her own heart. Her co-star, William Holden, had carried that silence like a punishment for the rest of his life. Now, in the twilight of his years, he was ready to set it free. The confession didn't come with tears or guilt, only stillness. The kind of stillness that fills the air after a life lived pretending that nothing ever happened. He spoke of a secret that had outlived both of them, of a love too fragile to survive the noise of fame. "Hollywood," he said, "rewards performance, not truth." And she, more than anyone, understood that. Behind every camera flash that captured her elegance, there was a tremor in her hands. Behind every charming smile on screen, there was a vow unbroken to never destroy what was beautiful by speaking it aloud. They met on set as strangers rehearsing affection. But when the lights went off, the act became too real. What began as dialogue turned into devotion, and then into distance. Because in the world they lived in, tenderness could end a career faster than cruelty. For years, Holden carried the weight of that unfinished story through bottles, through fame, through the endless echo of her laughter in his memory. And Audrey carried hers in silence, turning heartbreak into grace, loneliness into light. Now, with his voice trembling in the dim studio, he spoke not to clear his name, but to rescue hers from oblivion. The world had called her pure, perfect, untouchable. But he knew better. She wasn't an angel, he said. She was a woman who chose silence because the truth would have destroyed everyone she loved. And so, after half a century of silence, the story begins not with scandal, but with the courage not to speak. What happens when love becomes too sacred for words? And when silence lasts long enough, does it turn into forgiveness or regret? The story began in the spring of 1953, on a film set buzzing with the mechanical rhythm of cameras and rehearsals. Hollywood was still in its golden age, polished, rehearsed, and mercilessly bright. Audrey Hepburn was 24, fresh from Roman holiday, her name already written in light. William Holden, older by more than a decade, was at the height of his career a man of charm and contradictions, whose blue eyes could hold both warmth and warning. They met not as legends, but as two professionals rehearsing the delicate art of pretending to be in love. The film was Sabrina. She was the chauffeur's daughter, he, the playboy she could never have. Fate, with its cruel humor, had decided they would act out the very truth they were about to live. During those long days on the Paramount lot, something unspoken grew between them. It began with glances stolen between takes, the kind of looks that lingered too long to belong to fiction. Holden would joke to the crew about how Audrey's laughter could quiet an entire set, and she would blush, lowering her gaze as if afraid that looking back might make it real. But it was real. The director, Billy Wilder, later said he noticed it almost immediately. They didn't have to act. He told a friend. They were already inside the story. And that was the danger, because in Hollywood, the line between what was real and what was performed was not meant to be crossed. Holden was married then, with 3 children and a wife he respected but no longer understood. Audrey, raised by war and gentleness, believed in fidelity the way others believed in fate. She had seen enough of the world's destruction to crave only purity and quiet. She wanted love to be kind, honest, unbroken. But kindness and honesty rarely survive the machinery of fame. In the quiet moments between filming, they found fragments of peace, small escapes carved out of the chaos. A coffee shared in the back of the studio commissary, a hand brushing another as scripts changed hands. Words that never dared to bloom into confession. Holden once asked her, "Do you ever get tired of pretending?" She smiled softly. "Pretending is how I stay alive." He didn't know then that this was her truest confession. For Audrey, silence was not cowardice. It was armor. Still, one evening, the armor cracked. It was after a long day's shoot. The sky already bruised with dusk. Holden had invited a few colleagues to his home in Beverly Hills, a gathering meant to be harmless champagne, piano music, the ordinary glitter of their world. Audrey hesitated, then arrived late, wearing a simple black dress that seemed to swallow the light. When their eyes met across the room, the noise of the party dimmed. They spoke in a corner, voices low. Holden confessed that he hadn't felt alive in years, not until she looked at him the way no one else did, not as an actor, not as a name, but as a man. Audrey, trembling, said only, "We cannot hurt people who have already given us their lives." He touched her hand. "But what if silence hurts more?" That was the moment they both knew love had come. And it was already impossible. In the weeks that followed, their connection deepened in secret. They would drive together out of the city, along Mulholland Drive, the world below them flickering with lights like forgotten dreams. They never spoke of the future. They spoke of small things, the scent of jasmine in the air, the loneliness of fame, the comfort of being understood without words. And always, they spoke of silence. Holden wanted to leave everything behind. "We could go to Switzerland," he said once. "No cameras. No lies." But Audrey shook her head. There's no country far enough to escape a conscience. For her, duty and compassion were intertwined. She had survived the war as a child by staying quiet, by observing rather than speaking. That discipline had shaped her soul. She had learned that silence could save lives, and now, she believed it could save hearts too. Their last evening together came quietly, like a scene rewritten by regret. Audrey had finished filming and was preparing to leave for New York. Holden arrived at her hotel room carrying a small notebook. Inside, he had written her a single line. "If you ever change your mind, I'll still be here in the quiet." She read it, closed the notebook, and kissed his cheek. "You deserve someone brave," she whispered. "And I'm only kind." He watched her walk away, her silhouette dissolving into the hallway light. The next day, she boarded a plane to Italy, where she would soon meet Mel Ferrer, the man who would become her husband, her public protector, her safe choice. Reporters would call their marriage a fairy tale. Few knew it had been built on the ruins of a love story no one dared to name. As for Holden, he returned to his world of noise interviews, parties, movies, and endless bottles. His career continued, but something inside him had dimmed. Friends noticed it, a certain stillness in his laughter, a haunted pause before he answered questions about Sabrina. When journalists asked what it was like working with Audrey, he always said, "She was the kindest woman I ever met," and nothing more. In the years that followed, both carried on successful, admired, lonely in different ways. Audrey's life became a mosaic of grace and duty, films, humanitarian work, motherhood. Holden drifted between films and silence, aging faster than his years. Yet somewhere beneath the polished surface of their public lives, a quiet promise remained to never let their story become a scandal. Hollywood moved on. New stars rose. New myths were written. But for those who had been on that, Sabrina said, the memory never faded. They still remembered how the air changed when the two stood together, how a look across the room could make an entire crew fall silent. It was love, not the cinematic kind, but the forbidden, fragile kind that must survive without proof. Audrey's silence became her legend. Holden's regret became his sentence. And in that fragile balance between them lay the truth. Sometimes, the only way to keep something pure is to let it go before the world can touch it. There are loves that survive time, and there are loves that survive only through silence. For Audrey and William, silence became both their punishment and their prayer. After Sabrina, they returned to their separate lives, carrying the same invisible scar. She went on to marry Mel Ferrer, the actor who seemed made of calm, precision, and control. He spoke softly, dressed impeccably, and built a world for her that was quiet, orderly, and safe. But safety is rarely where love breathes. To the public eye, Audrey became untouchable, a saint of cinema, wrapped in Givenchy, smiling with angelic composure. She embodied everything the world wanted women to be: graceful, grateful, selfless. Yet beneath that serenity lived a quiet ache. In every interview, she spoke of discipline, humility, simplicity, words that sounded like virtue, but were, in truth, a vocabulary of restraint. Mel adored her, but his affection was built on admiration, not empathy. He loved the idea of her, the fragile perfection, the eternal muse. What he could not love was the part of her that still longed to speak of what had never been said. And so, Audrey retreated deeper into gentleness, learning to turn her pain into elegance, her longing into poise. She smiled, always, even when she felt the loneliness bloom behind her eyes. She wrote once in her diary, "I think kindness is the only language that doesn't hurt anyone. Perhaps that's why I use it too much." For Holden, kindness was a luxury he no longer believed in. After Audrey left, his world grew louder, rougher. He drank more, laughed louder, and let fame disguise decay. Behind the jokes and late-night parties, there was a man who had lost his compass. He kept her photograph in a drawer, folded in half to hide the tenderness on his own face. When he drank, he would unfold it and whisper, "She was the only one who didn't want anything from me." Hollywood, in its cruelty, rewarded his charm while punishing his softness. Every year, the roles became harder, the expectations heavier. He was a man who had tasted truth and then been forced to live on performance. Friends would sometimes find him sitting alone after a shoot, staring into space. "You know," he said once, "the hardest thing about acting is that I never stop pretending, even when the cameras are gone." He did not name her, but everyone knew who haunted his silences. For Audrey, life became a choreography of control. On screen, she moved like light itself, graceful, deliberate, almost weightless. But off-screen, she often fell ill, her body quietly collapsing under the strain of perfection. She miscarried more than once, her health weakened by exhaustion and emotional restraint. Doctors advised rest, but rest was impossible in a world that demanded radiance. In the rare moments she allowed herself to remember Holden, she did not think of the passion, she thought of the stillness, of the space between his words, of the way he had once said, "I could tell the truth, but it would ruin you." She never answered him then, perhaps because she already knew the truth ruins everyone. The years moved on, but memory does not obey calendars. When they met again, it was the late 1960s, for a film reunion that never quite happened. Holden had aged sharply, lines carved deep by whiskey and regret. Audrey, still luminous, had the air of someone who had lived 1,000 quiet heartbreaks. When he saw her again, he said only, "You look like forgiveness." She smiled gently. And you look like someone who still needs it. They talked for an hour, politely, carefully, like survivors discussing an old wound. No one else in the room knew that every pause between their words was the sound of the life they never had. When he reached to hold her hand, she let him only for a second. Then she withdrew, as if to protect both of them from the past. After that meeting, they never saw each other again. A few years later, in November 1981, William Holden was found dead in his apartment, a fall. They said, the kind that happens when someone drinks alone too long. The newspapers called it an accident. Hollywood called it a tragedy. But to Audrey, it was something else, an echo finally gone silent. When the news reached her in Switzerland, she locked herself in her room for hours. No tears, no hysteria, only stillness. That night, she went out to the garden of her villa in Tolokanaz, where the air was cold and the stars painfully clear. She looked up and whispered, "You kept your promise. You stayed in the quiet." Those who knew her said she changed after that night. Something gentler, but infinitely sadder, entered her eyes. She began to work less in film and more in humanitarian missions, as if to make sense of the pain by transforming it into service. In Somalia, in Bangladesh, in Ethiopia, she held starving children in her arms and called it love. She would later tell a journalist, "Perhaps we can only heal the world by healing what we once lost inside ourselves." She never spoke of Holden again. Not publicly. Not even in her final interviews. When journalists asked about Sabrina, she would smile, look away, and say, "That was a long time ago." But some people never really leave you. Behind that sentence lay a lifetime of self-discipline, a woman who had mastered the art of turning heartbreak into compassion. For Audrey, silence had never been emptiness. It was a choice, a way to preserve the sanctity of what had been real in a world that consumed every secret it could find. Yet silence has a cost. There were nights when she could not sleep, when she would sit by the window with a cigarette and stare into the dark, the smoke curling like unanswered prayers. Mel would sometimes wake and ask, "Are you all right?" She would smile and say, "Yes, I'm just thinking of a friend." But the truth was that she was thinking of all the words she had buried. Love, when denied voice, becomes haunting. It lingers like perfume on an empty stage, invisible but unmistakable. For Audrey, the ghost of Holden lived not in regret, but in gentleness. Every time she offered kindness to a stranger, every time she chose patience over anger, she was loving him again quietly, safely, without consequence. In the end, their tragedy was not that they could not be together. It was that they understood each other too completely. He, a man who could not stop confessing. She, a woman who could not bear to destroy what silence protected. If love is a conversation between souls, theirs was one spoken entirely in pauses. And in that silence, that luminous, eternal silence, they both found the closest thing to peace the world would allow them. The confession came quietly, not on a stage, but in a dimly lit studio that smelled of dust and memory. The man who spoke was old now, 79. His voice hoarse from years of whiskey and regret. Cameras framed him like witnesses. When the interviewer asked what he remembered most about Audrey Hepburn, he didn't begin with her beauty, or her fame, or her films. He began with silence. "She didn't speak much," he said. "But when she did, you listened as if the world could end between one word and the next." His hands trembled as he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small black notebook, edges torn, pages yellowed. The same notebook he had given her 40 years earlier. The one that held a single sentence, "If you ever change your mind, it'll still be here in the quiet." He opened it now, revealing that she had written back. The page was barely filled, her handwriting small and precise. "I never changed my mind. I just kept my promise." That was all. 2 lines, written decades ago, left unsent. The interviewer sat in silence, unsure whether to speak. The cameras kept rolling. He continued. People thought she was shy, but she wasn't shy. She was brave in a way this town never understood. She knew that sometimes love isn't about possession, it's about preservation. He paused, looking down at the page again. I used to think her silence meant she didn't love me enough. Now I know it meant she loved too purely to make it ugly. The tape, later aired in fragments, shocked the industry for a brief moment. It wasn't scandal that stirred the headlines, but tenderness, an unfamiliar word in the vocabulary of Hollywood. Reporters wrote about the love Audrey never spoke of. For once, the gossip columns went quiet, as if even they sensed that this was not a story to exploit, but to revere. That night, the old actor left the studio without waiting for applause. Outside, the city hummed with the same artificial energy that had once devoured their youth. He walked slowly, each step echoing the distance between who he was and who he might have been. Later, in his hotel room, he placed the notebook on the bedside table. Next to it lay a small photograph, Audrey in Rome, her hair tied back, eyes half closed in laughter. He turned off the light and whispered, "You were right." Silence lasts longer than fame. When the footage aired a week later, the world listened differently. The interview wasn't about guilt or confession, it was about clarity. For the first time, the audience saw Audrey's silence not as mystery, but as authorship. She had written her own ending by refusing to let others define it. The narrative shifted. People began to revisit her films with new eyes. In Breakfast at Tiffany's, when she stands by the window, refusing to say what she truly feels, they saw it now as autobiography. In Roman Holiday, when she walks away from the man she loves to return to duty, it was no longer performance, but truth. Every role she had played became a fragment of her real story, a woman who learned to love by letting go. In Tolokanaz, Switzerland, her former gardener would later recall how, in her final years, Audrey often sat in the garden at dusk, a small notebook on her lap. She'd open it, read something, and smile to herself. He said, I asked her once what it was, and she just said, a memory that doesn't need words. Perhaps it was the same notebook. Perhaps not. But those who had known her best, her sons, her closest friends, agreed on one thing. She never forgot William Holden. Not as a scandal, not as a secret, but as a kindness that once made her feel human in a world determined to make her divine. And maybe that is why she never denied him, even when she could have erased his name entirely from her story. In her silence, she had preserved his dignity as much as her own. She had turned love into something untouchable, not because it was forbidden, but because it was sacred. In the end, his confession did not break her legend. It completed it. For decades, people had adored Audrey Hepburn for her elegance. But now, they began to admire her for something rarer: restraint. In a culture built on exposure, she had practiced the most radical act imaginable: discretion. The final truth, then, was not in what was revealed, but in what had been kept hidden all along: the proof that love can exist without demand, that two souls can touch without destroying the worlds they belong to. When the old actor died a few months later, the notebook was found beside him, still open to the page with her words. No headlines followed. No scandal broke. Only a quiet ripple through those who had once cared to look deeper. And in that silence, the same one she had chosen, the story finally found its peace. In the end, The world remembered Audrey Hepburn not for the scandals she avoided, but for the silences she kept. Her beauty faded only to reveal something more enduring, a serenity born of discipline, of mercy, of knowing when not to speak. Love had visited her life like a delicate season, too brief for explanation, too sacred for confession. And when it passed, she did not chase it, she carried it quietly, like a small light cupped in her hands, protecting it from the wind. William Holden had once believed that the only proof of love was to name it aloud. But Audrey taught him, and through him, all of us, that sometimes love's truest form is absence. That silence, when chosen with grace, can be an act of profound devotion. The world calls it tragedy when two people meant for each other never find their way back. But perhaps it is not tragedy, perhaps it is art. The kind that endures not because it is perfect, but because it remains unfinished. And so their story ends not with goodbye, but with stillness, a woman looking out a window in Rome, a man whispering her name in the dark, and the eternal space between them untouched, unspoiled. Because some loves are not meant to be lived. They are meant to be remembered. And perhaps that is what Audrey understood better than anyone. That silence, when it comes from love, is never empty. It is full of everything that words cannot bear to hold.